Welcome back. The Alliance for Gun Responsibility strives to save lives and reduce the harm caused by gun violence across communities. Their mission is centered on advocacy, public education, and forming partnerships to make lasting change. Joining us is the Chief of Staff at the Alliance for Gun Responsibility, Ryan Disch-Guzman. Ryan, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, can you explain the overall mission of the Alliance for Gun Responsibility and the role it plays in advocating for gun violence prevention?
Yeah, so our mission is to prevent gun violence by encouraging a balance of rights with responsibilities. We believe that everyone should be able to exist and live in a safe community. And that means making sure that we have policies and best practices in communities that make sure that we are preventing gun violence, that we are not just reacting to gun violence as a public safety issue, but that we are truly preventing it from occurring in the first place. And that looks all sorts of ways. That's making sure that folks understand the laws that we have that already exist, and making sure we expand upon those laws and things that we know do work. I think we've seen a lot of progress. We're based in Washington State, and so we've made a lot of progress in Washington. We were one of, we were middle of the road when it came to gun violence prevention and gun safety, and now we're one of the best states in the country when it comes to gun safety. And a part of that has been listening to communities, being very local, being present in our state legislature, and moving to make sure that that communities are safer. We were formed after the Sandy Hook shooting, and a lot of our activist base, a lot of our volunteers and supporters came out of that movement and wanted to make sure that policy shifted. And it's because of that intentionality and making sure that we were listening to folks on the local level that we were able to shift that change. We really believe that change comes from gun violence prevention and gun safety issues at the local level. That's why we're not just interested in supporting Washington State in building out our state efforts, but also states throughout the country and making sure that they have state-based infrastructure to push for gun safety policy and legislation at their local level.
Now, what were some of those key policies that the Alliance advocated for in an effort to prevent gun violence?
Yeah, so one of the big ones that we've supported is an assault weapons ban. That was a really big push for us and took a lot of coalition building, a lot of partnership building. And assault weapons are really important, but they're not the full solution to the puzzle when it comes to gun violence prevention. There's also things like what's commonly known as like a red flag law or an extreme risk protection order. Those are incredibly important because they make sure that those who are at risk of violence and have ownership of a gun are making sure that that weapon can be removed for the safety of an individual, of a family. There's a lot of misconceptions around red flag laws or ERPOS. The thing is they're temporary. They're meant to be protective, and they're meant to prevent things like homicides and suicides and domestic violence. So there's laws like assault weapons bans that help, but there's also things that are tools like extreme risk protection orders that we've passed in Washington that truly help save lives because they're able to be a tool that law enforcement can use in a crisis to prevent gun violence. So it's not just these big policies that help move gun violence prevention along, but it's also smaller things too. And like this one of the big pushes that we've done recently is also just to promote community violence intervention orgs and organizations that are working in hospitals and clinics that are also just responding to crisis and trauma and making sure that violence is interrupted really early on. If someone shows up with a gunshot wound to a hospital, they're getting a social worker, they're getting a mental health professional, and they're getting support from the community. Those are incredibly important as well in interrupting violence, but they're so deeply underfunded. And so one of the big things that we push now is to make sure that those organizations and those groups are truly funded. So there's lots of little pieces that prevent gun violence. We need all of them. We need as many tools in the tool belt as possible So there's these big policies, and then there's these smaller policies that actually create a big impact too. So it's a big net we try to weave.
Now, what role do grassroots volunteers play in advancing the Alliance's mission, and how can people get involved?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, our entire movement is built off of grassroots activism. Our organization started as a grassroots organization, like I said, after the Sandy Hook shooting, of folks who wanted to see a change in gun policy. And what's really important, I think, is showing up. I think what has happened in a lot of activism recently is it's become very much online, and a lot of folks stick to their activism online. But I think what truly moves movements is when people show up in community, in person together, and push their local officials, whether it be their city council, their school board, all the way to their governor. If you show up, if you door knock, if you show up during legislative session, if you show up when a policy is coming up on a city council or a county council, matters to people. People notice that, and showing up is really, really, really key. I think on our website, gunresponsibility.org, we have a lot of information around like how to get involved, what it looks like to get involved. I encourage folks to connect with their local organizations that are working on gun violence prevention, particularly community violence intervention orgs that are doing a lot of really incredible work, and asking how you can help, because they always need help, whether it is things like door knocking or showing up at city council or helping to get folks elected who are gun violence prevention champions. The showing up is really key, but it's a really wonderful community of survivors and activists and youth and church members who are all trying to make sure that we save lives in our communities. So I encourage folks to get involved. It's a really beautiful, wonderful community, and we have made progress. It can be a frustrating issue space sometimes, but we've made progress because of our dedicated grassroots activists.
Now, you mentioned something that I thought was very interesting, and that's how a lot of activism is kind of online these days. Now, I can definitely see how that's convenient for a lot of people, but where do you think it's beneficial to kind of be online with your activism? And then, when do you think we should take it to that next step where we're in person?
Yeah, I think about this a lot, especially recently, and I think one of the big ways that we can create impacts is by creating community. And how we do that is when you're online, if you're just engaging with folks that you never see day to day, I would say that doesn't really cause change. What does cause change is when the people you're talking to online are folks in a community that you meet offline, that you create things offline with, that you create support with. That is incredibly important, because I think sometimes in a very digital world, it can be very isolating, and you can often feel very alone. And for gun violence prevention, in the gun violence prevention space, that can often happen, is feeling very alone in your issue space, and like feeling like, am I the only one who feels this way? But I think when you come together as a community, you realize like there's other people that think this way, there's other people that believe in this mission, and you get inspired, you get empowered. So I think it's important to like organize online. I think it's important to like find those common people online, but then it's equally as important to meet those people offline, and build community and community support together. I think that's kind of what we've seen really, really works. Is we'll go to, we're not afraid to go to rural communities and talk to folks about things like safe storage that we know most gun owners agree with and want better access to. So we'll have those conversations with folks, and that's only able to really happen in community, and like talking with people in their community, understanding their community, meeting them where they are. So I think I think social media and the internet have their uses in terms of organizing, but I think also that organizing needs to have ground support. It needs to have community support. I believe that we grow in our grassroots activism when we're put in uncomfortable situations and with people that don't necessarily agree with us, and that can only really happen offline. But we also built a beautiful, great community in this movement. And I encourage folks to kind of, I know it can be nerve wracking to kind of meet strangers and develop new community, but I think it's important. I think it's helpful. And I think we have a wonderful community. So that's where I encourage people is like, being on social media makes it easy to just say your opinion and push your activism. But I think what actually moves movements is meeting in community, meeting in the real world, for lack of a better term, with other people, and being and talking with folks, living in community. I think it really does move things.
Now, the Alliance has made significant strides with gun violence prevention laws. How do you ensure that these laws are enforced and have a tangible impact on public safety?
Yeah, that's a great question. And they need to go hand in hand. It's one thing to pass policy, it's a whole other to implement it. And so when we talk to folks, we say like, yes, we help push and pass policy, but this is a year-round job and we're making sure that it gets implemented as well. Because you can pass a policy, but if there's no infrastructure to support it, it's just going to fall flat on its face. And so that is where building partnerships is incredibly important. We've built partnerships with law enforcement, with prosecutors, with domestic violence advocates, with, I mentioned before, hospital intervention organizations, community violence intervention organizations, making sure that those folks, when a policy passes, they have the support to make it happen. Little things like grants, making sure they get the grants that have been appropriated during a session, making sure that law enforcement have the tools they need to actually enforce a law. Making sure that mental health professionals are available when those laws get enforced too. So there's all these little moving parts that are incredibly important. And when we make those partnerships within the community, we hear from those folks. Like right now, we're listening to them of like what can be improved, what are policy changes that we can help support them in the legislative session to make sure that those laws and policies are actually applied. So that is an incredibly important part of it. Also, it's just, we as an organization, as an issue space, we have to have a legal strategy because our laws get challenged all the time in the courts. And so making sure that that's also there as well, that when we pass policy, that we feel like it's sound policy that's constitutional, and then having, some great strategic lawyers who are able to defend those laws in courts. So it doesn't just begin and end, at elections and in legislative sessions, but it's also on the outside of it, making sure that communities have all the resources they need to adequately, make sure that gun violence prevention is adhering to public safety and public health. A lot of moving parts there, but making sure that communities have the support they need.
Now, what impact is gun violence having on marginalized communities, and how does the Alliance address these disparities?
Yeah, there's a large disproportionality. Gun violence affects Black and Brown communities at far higher rates, and we see rises across the board, including Black suicide rates, and that is something that we want to make sure that that there's intentionality behind it. And I think one of the big reasons we're big advocates for community violence intervention orgs, which are organizations that work in communities that are mostly Black-led organizations that are focusing within the Black community to make sure that there are support and resources for youth, and really working on youth especially, and working on the ground to make sure that folks have housing support, have food support, have mentorship and jobs, and making sure that those communities are truly taken care of, and doing it from a way that's like culturally respectful, that is preventing things like over policing. If they can prevent gun violence within communities, then they can hopefully prevent police interactions, so that communities get what they need. So we really want to see that field grow and build, because in communities where they have really robust community violence intervention organizations, they see a drop in gun violence, and that's just because caring people in their community are coming to them and making sure that they have what they need. And that's incredibly, incredibly important. We want to build up these communities so that they feel supportive and successful. And that's a key that of preventing gun violence that folks don't talk about enough, is making sure that communities have basic resources and have community support. It's, we have great partnerships with law enforcement, but it's not enough to just invest in law enforcement. Law enforcement is a reactive response to gun violence. Community violence intervention orgs are a proactive preventative response. And so when we think about disproportionality, it's about making sure that communities have the things that they need. Community violence intervention orgs are a great key to that. And we want to make sure that that field grows.
Now, with that, how do you tailor, your content to educate different, audiences or community members about gun violence? I would say, being from New York, when I think of gun violence, it may be different from how somebody in Texas thinks about gun violence. So, with that in mind, how do you tailor, your education when we're talking about gun violence?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I think it's, we need to speak to all communities, and different ways that communities view firearms, and that it's vitally important. I live in a rural area. The way that firearms are talked about here is very different than it is in an urban area. And I think, I can give an example, like, if somebody, a lot of people who own guns, they do it for what they see as their own personal protection. And I think that is, you got to meet people where they are in terms of where they're, why. And a lot of people who live in cities, like, that is the main reason why they're owning a firearm. And that comes from all sorts of reasons, for, not trusting law enforcement, feeling that their community is unsafe. Um, Someone might have an abusive partner that they're trying to protect themselves from, any host of reasons why. And I think in entering those conversations, I personally never want to go into those conversations and say, oh, you shouldn't own a firearm and these are the reasons why. I mean, there's lots of stats behind that, of how you're more likely to be, injured or harmed or killed by your firearm than you are to protect yourself from one. And there's just so many stats on that. But that's not helpful in a situation where someone feels like they need a firearm to protect themselves. They're weighing their risks and they're choosing that. And I think when it comes to that point, how we enter those conversations is listening and then supporting as best as possible. And I think some of the strategies we use are just, around harm reduction, around making sure that, like, hey, if you're going to own a firearm, here's how to safely store it. Here's a place where you can be trained on safe storage. Here's information on extreme risk protection orders, red flag laws, in case, someone in your family feels suicidal, like, you can have that gun temporarily removed, things like that. I think talking through that with folks, that's what most people, they want to hear that side of it. They want to know how they can be protective, just in general. I think that's true across communities. So I think it's listening to what that community is saying that they need, and two, giving them tools to protect themselves and to make sure that they're safe if they're going to own a firearm. It's really that listening and that giving people options.
Well, Ryan, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I know that this is a topic that definitely, is a concern for many people across the country. So I truly appreciate you taking the time to speak with us right here in the Bronx. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.